All right, welcome in everyone to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be focusing in on something pretty specific, the Jamaican agricultural market. We're zeroing in on the weeks of March 8th and March 15th, 2025, and we're going to uncover some, maybe some surprising shifts and some trends that were happening during that little snapshot in time.
Yeah, and if you're someone who wants to, get a good grasp on how things are moving in the market, but you don't really want to dig through like mountains of data and numbers, this is definitely the place for you. We've done the heavy lifting. We've looked at the agricultural market data, comparing those two specific weeks.
Yeah.
We're going to break it all down into digestible pieces.
Exactly.
We're going to look at price trends, the volatility, basically, how unpredictable the market is.
Right.
And also the supply conditions across different regions in Jamaica.
Yeah, and the mission here, I guess, is to help you really understand the overall, how things were moving during those 2 weeks. Were there any opportunities? Were there any things that, maybe you should have been watching out for? That kind of thing.
Exactly.
So to just kick things off, what was kind of the overall feel of the market in those 2 weeks when you compare them side by side?
Well, one of the first things that kind of jumps out is how the price increases were changing.
Okay.
So in the week ending March 8th, the average market price went up 1.46%, which brought it to about $654.58. Now, the following week, ending March 15th, the average price kept going up. It got to $691.76.
Okay.
But the rate at which it was increasing slowed way down to just 0.19%.
Interesting. So it's still going up,
Yeah.
but not as fast.
Exactly.
So do you think maybe that could mean that some things are still, pushing those average prices higher, but others maybe are starting to level off?
That's a really good point. It's totally possible that we're seeing some products, some commodities still, going strong, prices are up,
Yeah.
while others are kind of, stabilizing or maybe even going down a little bit, which would then pull down that overall rate of increase.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, I remember you mentioned volatility,
Yeah.
how unpredictable things are in the market. What was that like during those 2 weeks?
Yeah, the volatility stayed pretty high both weeks.
Yeah.
Essentially, what volatility means is it's measuring, how much and how quickly those prices are changing.
Right.
A high percentage means there were big swings in the prices of all sorts of different goods within that week.
Gotcha.
So in the first week, the average volatility was a pretty substantial 40.93%.
Oh,
Then it went down a little to 36.98% in the second week.
okay.
But even with that drop, it still tells us that things were pretty unpredictable in the market, even though, like we said, the overall average price increase was slowing down.
Right. So, even though it was slowing down overall, there was still a lot of, ups and downs.
Exactly.
Or individual things.
Exactly, yeah. It was a bumpy ride for some of those specific items.
So, okay, let's zoom in on a few of those individual items that were really moving. What were some of the big winners, the ones that saw the biggest price increases?
So the star of the show, the one that really took off, was Gungo peas, the green ones.
Okay.
During that week ending March 8th, their price shot up by a huge 40.91%, and that got us to a price of about $1,298.
Okay.
But here's the thing. The next week, it didn't just keep going up. It sped up even more. It jumped by a whopping 60.61% and landed at $1,342.65.
So it was almost like accelerating.
Exactly. And that kind of steady upward climb where it's not just going up, but it's going up faster and faster, often tells us that there's strong demand. People really want those Gungo peas.
Right. So if you're looking for opportunities, maybe Gungo peas would be a good place to look.
It's certainly something to keep an eye on.
Absolutely. What about other items? Were there any others that saw these huge price jumps?
Ginger actually had a good run in that first week with a 49.17% increase, bringing it up to $913.78.
Okay.
But then in the second week, it just vanished from the list of top gainers.
Ooh.
Gone.
So it was like a quick spike and then it leveled off.
Yeah, that's possible.
Okay, interesting. Were there any items that weren't really big movers in that first week, but then suddenly jumped up in the second week?
Yeah, you know what? Imported cauliflower. That was a surprise.
Okay.
It really came out of nowhere in that second week as a top performer. Its price shot up by 38.83% and hit $2,225.63.
Wow.
And the thing is, it wasn't even in the top 5 gainers the week before.
Interesting.
So something definitely shifted.
Yeah.
Maybe it was a change in imports, or maybe local demand suddenly went way up.
Right.
Who knows?
Those are the kind of like surprises that can really, throw you off.
Exactly. It's all about staying on top of those changes.
Now, I remember green bananas kind of had a wild ride in those 2 weeks.
Oh, yeah. Green banana was all over the place.
What happened?
So, get this. In the week ending March 8th, their price went down by 8.89%.
Okay.
Then the next week, it did a complete 180 and jumped up by a huge 32.98%.
Oh, wow.
Ending at $250.11. That kind of sharp turnaround, especially when you think about how unpredictable the overall market was, tells us that something was going on with green bananas.
Right.
Maybe there were supply problems, or maybe people's eating habits changed.
Yeah. Okay, interesting. Now let's flip the script and talk about the biggest price drops. What items took a hit?
Well, sorrel really stood out in that second week as the top price decliner. Its price dropped by a pretty big 18.75%, which brought it down to $120.78. And what's interesting is that it wasn't even on the list of top declining items the week before.
So that was a sudden drop.
Oh, yeah, it really came out of nowhere.
Interesting. So do you have any idea why that might have happened?
Well, maybe there was suddenly more sorrel available, or maybe demand just dropped off.
Right. It's amazing how things can change so quickly.
It really is.
Now, what about sweet peppers? I remember those having a, kind of a noticeable price shift as well.
Yeah. Sweet pepper, specifically the yellow variety, went through a complete reversal. In that first week, its price went up by a solid 20.54%. It got to Jay's $781. But then by the second week, it had fallen sharply by 17.46%, down to Jay's $737.
Okay.
And the red sweet peppers did something similar.
Okay.
They had a big price decrease in the second week, something like 14.29%, down to Jay's $722.86. So it seems like both those varieties had a big price correction after that initial increase.
Right. So a big increase and then a big drop.
Yep, just like that.
It really shows you how fast things can change.
Absolutely.
Were there any other notable price drops?
Yeah. Honeydew melon is another interesting one.
Right.
In that first week, the price went down by 14.29%, but then in the second week, it flipped and became a pretty big gainer.
Oh, wow. So we went down and then back up?
Yep. And then there's cantaloupe. It also dropped by 14.29% in that first week, but then it didn't show up on the list of top decliners for the second week.
Okay.
So maybe its price kind of stabilized after that initial drop.
Okay. Now, we've been talking about the overall volatility in the market, how unpredictable things were. Were there any specific items that were just consistently showing huge price swings?
Yeah, definitely. Tomato, specifically the plummy variety, that one had high volatility both weeks.
Okay.
So in that first week, the volatility was a crazy 64.73%, and the price actually went down by 12.44%, ending at $175.86. But get this, in the second week, the volatility went up even higher to 70.08%.
Wow.
But this time, the price went up by 12.32% to $185.94.
So the volatility was high, but the price could go either way.
Exactly. That's why it's so unpredictable. It's hard to know what to expect from week to week.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
What other items were showing that same kind of consistent high volatility?
Well, hot pepper, the West Indian red kind, that was another one that had high volatility both weeks. It was 68.15% in the first week and 63.17% in the second.
Okay.
But, what's interesting is that even with those crazy price swings within each week, the overall price actually went up a little bit. It went from J at $118.43 to J $836.45.
So even with all the ups and downs, it still ended up a bit higher.
Yep. It's like it was on a roller coaster, but still managed to climb a hill overall.
Okay. Now, we can't forget green banana here.
Oh, yeah, good point. Green banana, that was like the poster child for volatility.
Right.
Besides the big price swings between the weeks, it also had high volatility within each week.
Right.
We're talking 57.83% and then 51.1%.
Right. It's kind of all over the place.
Yeah.
All right. So tomatoes, hot peppers, green bananas, those are the ones to really watch out for, I guess.
Definitely keep those on your radar.
Okay. Good to know. Now, let's zoom out a little bit and talk about different regions in Jamaica. Were there any areas that stood out in terms of price differences or anything like that?
For sure. Kingston and St. Andrew, they consistently had the highest prices. And what's really interesting is that their price increases actually got even bigger between those two rents. They jumped from 19.15% in the first week to a whopping 38.75% in the second week. The average price there ended up being $914.89.
Wow, so not only were prices high there, but they were going up even faster than everywhere else.
Yeah, exactly. That suggests maybe people in Kingston and St. Andrew really wanted those products, or maybe they were having trouble getting enough supply to meet the demand.
Right. What about other places?
Well, St. Catherine, it also stayed pretty high priced, but those extreme jumps we saw in the first week, which was like a crazy 145.86%, they calmed down quite a bit in the second week.
Okay.
It was still a big increase at 65.38%, but nothing like that first week. The average price there ended up being $895.59.
So maybe things were starting to settle down a little bit in St. Catherine.
Yeah, maybe. It's possible.
Now, I remember Portland was having some issues with supply, right?
Yeah, Portland. It was tough for them to get enough of certain items both weeks.
Okay.
Even with a few small price adjustments, like a small increase at first, and then a tiny decrease of 3.76% in that second week, which brought the price to $715.87.
Okay.
But the main problem was that they just didn't have enough stuff.
Right.
That tells us that there were some big challenges with their supply chain. You know, maybe getting stuff into Portland or producing it locally was really difficult.
Yeah. Okay. What about St. Anne? What was going on there?
So St. Anne kept having those big price swings, but did calm down a little bit in that second week. The volatility went from a super high 95.96% down to 28.9%, which is still high, but, you know, it's better.
Yeah.
The average price there ended up at $613.63.
Okay.
So basically, prices were still moving around a lot during the week, but not quite as dramatically as before.
Okay, interesting. All right, so we talked about different regions. Let's talk about the overall availability of products, the supply.
Yeah.
Did we see any big changes there between those 2 weeks?
Yeah, there were some changes. Overall, it looks like the supply situation got a little bit better. The number of items that were classified as scarce, really hard to find, went down from 21.19% in that week ending March 8th to 18.23% the following week.
Okay.
And the number of items with fair supply, that also dropped. It went from 20.61% down to 16.98%. So it seems like the most extreme shortages were easing up a little bit.
Right, so it was getting slightly better, but still not, perfect.
Exactly, yeah.
Now, what about the other categories? The ones that weren't scarce or fair?
So the moderate supply category, that one stayed pretty much the same.
Okay.
It was around 31% both weeks. But, and this is important, there was a big jump in the amount of missing data, where we just didn't have info on the supply.
Oh, interesting.
That NA category, it went way up from 15.15% to 23.43%.
Okay.
So basically, for a bigger chunk of the items in that second week, we just didn't know how much was available. And that can make it really hard to understand the big picture.
Right, because if you don't have the data, you can't, fully analyze the situation.
Exactly. It's like trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces.
So, okay, we've covered a lot. We've talked about the overall market trends, specific items, regional differences, and the supply situation. What does all this mean for someone trying to, get a handle on the Jamaican agricultural market? What are some key takeaways here?
All right, so first off, those Gungo peas, those are definitely something to pay attention to.
Okay.
The price just kept going up and up, and it reached $1,342.65. If you're growing or selling Gungo peas, you're probably doing pretty well.
Yeah, that seems like a pretty clear opportunity. What else should people be thinking about?
Well, those green bananas, remember how much the price jumped around?
Yeah.
That's a market that needs to be watched very carefully.
Okay.
It went from a price decrease to a big increase in just a week. That suggests that it could easily change direction again. The current price is $250.11, so you got to be careful with those.
So keep a close eye on green bananas.
Exactly. Don't make any sudden moves without knowing what's happening.
Now, what about those sweet peppers? The ones that had those big price changes up and then down. What should people be doing there?
Yeah, those sweet peppers, both yellow and red.
Yeah.
The fact that they went up and then down so quickly, it's a sign that something's going on with supply and demand.
Right.
Maybe people need to adjust how much they're growing or how they're selling them. The current prices are $737 for the yellow ones and $722.86 for the red ones.
Okay. So definitely something to think about if you're dealing with sweet peppers.
For sure.
And what about the regional differences? Anything to keep in mind there?
Yeah, Portland. Remember how they were struggling to get enough of certain items?
Right.
That situation needs to be addressed.
Okay.
They need to figure out ways to make their supply chain more efficient or find ways to grow more things locally. And one more thing, the fact that so many prices were jumping around, that volatility we talked about, it means that farmers might want to think about diversifying what they're growing.
Okay, I see. So, like, don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Exactly. If you're growing a bunch of different things, then if one market crashes, it won't be a total disaster.
Right. So, to wrap it all up, our little deep dive into the Jamaican agricultural market in those 2 weeks in March 2025. What can we say?
Well, overall, prices did go up a bit, but there was a lot of volatility, a lot of ups and downs, and different items were behaving in very different ways. The Gungo peas, that seems like a really good opportunity, but those volatile items like green bananas, those are riskier.
Right.
And don't forget about those supply problems in Portland. That's something that needs to be dealt with.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, hopefully this has given you, the listener, a good overview of what was going on in the market.
Yeah, and it gets you thinking, right?
Yeah.
You know, all these changes we saw, those price jumps and drops and the supply issues, they're not happening in a vacuum. So here's something to ponder. What bigger things are influencing these trends?
Yeah.
Could it be the economy, the weather, global trade, something else entirely? And if we can understand those bigger forces, we can make better predictions about what the market will do in the future.
Yeah. Some really great food for thought.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, everyone.
Yep. See you next time.
And until next time, keep on diving.